this famous quote about pornography. It was like, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, right? And so belonging can feel really hard to define,
Right.
specifically what it is or feels like, but you know it whenever you feel it. You
Mhm.
know when you don't belong, and when you know whenever you do belong.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize a conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started.
From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented. Represented.
AI is shaping your coaching business, whether you realize it or not. But here's the problem. AI bias can exclude, misrepresent, and reinforce dangerous ideologies. And that directly impacts your messaging, your marketing, and ultimately your client experience. If you're using AI tools in your coaching or content creation, you need to know how bias shows up and what to do about it. That's why I created the AI Bias Guide, a free and practical resource designed for coaches and course creators who care about inclusion. In it, I share what AI bias is and why it matters for your online business, real-world examples of AI bias in marketing and client engagement, the first step you can take toward ethical AI use. Grab your free AI bias guide today by heading over to anikishuru.com/AI-bias or simply go to the show notes for the link. My gosh, you are in for an incredible podcast episode. This week, it is a masterclass. Honestly, this should be a paid masterclass because the gems that Sonia drops are simply worthy of a masterclass. You need to grab a pen and a notebook and just sit down and take notes. And I know I will be doing that. I loved this conversation so much. I did not want it to end. After I stopped recording, we stayed on and talked some more. Sonia is a real deal, and she knows her craft so, so well. And some of the things that stood out for me, there were a few, and I just want to share them with you before I read her bio for you and we get into the conversation. She said something that will stay with me for a really long time. Inclusion and DEI are not the same. They are cousins. And she goes on and explains that. So that's something that I really want you to pay attention to because a lot of times, and even in the current times that we're living in, DEI is often confused with any form of inclusion. And she kind of dispels that myth for us. And then she goes on to talk about main character energy when it comes to whatever form of diversity that you choose to amplify in your online business, that you are bringing in main character energy. You have to listen to that bit. And then there's where she talks about how to select which form of diversity you go with, because there's just so many different forms. You know, there's race and ethnicity, there is disability, there is religion, there is LGBTQIA plus community issues. There's just so many forms of this. There's ageism, all sorts of things. And so, how do you zero in on the one when there are just so many factors that are, you're kind of feeling overwhelmed, like you need to address everything in your business? She gives us an answer to that. More than anything, what I loved is she's just a natural storyteller. So she shared so many different analogies that allow you to really understand. It goes from just knowing what this concept is, knowing that representation matters, to understanding how and why representation matters. And so here's a little bit about Sonia. She is an inclusive marketing strategist, consultant, and coach who helps brands attract bigger and more diverse and fiercely loyal customer bases. She writes columns for Inc., Forbes, and HubSpot on inclusive marketing, customer experience, and belonging, which we spoke about a fair bit. She's also the host, and you have to subscribe to the Inclusion and Marketing podcast. People, as you can tell, I'm really tripping over my words here. I cannot wait to introduce you to Sonia Thompson. And so, without further ado, here is Sonia Thompson. Everybody, welcome back to Represented Podcast. Today I've got the wonderful Sonia Thompson all the way from Florida, USA. She is somebody I have been listening to your podcast for quite a number of years, and the topics are so like for me very in the line of my interest. So every time you release a podcast. I'm like, oh, I gotta listen to that. But more than anything in recent years, Sonia, what I've been doing is really taking the time to reflect on what you've shared and just see how is this impacting me personally, not just as a racial equity coach, but for me as an individual, how important representation is. And so I'm really happy that you're here and that we get to have this conversation, Sonia.
Oh, thank you so much for that. It's an honor that you are a listener and that you get value out of it. And I'm just really thrilled to be here with you and to have this chat.
All right, let's start with the question or start from the beginning. How did you arrive here doing what you're doing, inclusive marketing strategist and consultant? And the thing is, you do it so well. Uh, there's a personal way with which you engage. Your content is so, even the way you write for Forbes. I was reading quite a few articles you've written, and there's just you're talented. Like that's your zone of genius. I think you found what you were born to do. How did you get here?
Oh, well, thank you again. I love to really embrace this notion of nothing is ever wasted. So if I think about that and if I believe that, then all the experiences that I've had in my life have prepared me for this because this is what I live, right? So, I am someone with a lot of differences. I'm a Black woman. I'm left-handed. Early in my 20s, I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disorder. Later on, during my 20s is whenever I was working in corporate America, and I very much felt I was there for 9 years, once I finished business school, what it was like to not feel like you belonged. From the time that I was in school, I was very much accustomed to being one of the only or one of a few in my classes, right? And then whenever I went to university, I went to an HBCU, that's a historically Black college and university, and I understood what it was like to be in a place where you felt like you belonged because you were around people who were to see you, they get you, they understand you. And then later on, fast forward, as a business owner, um, again, this is kind of stems personally. I was a business owner who was location independent. So I started doing a lot of travel and I found myself in Argentina where I lived for 4 years. So being someone who lived outside of my country of birth, that provided some perspective. And then I met and married my husband, who is Argentine. He speaks Spanish, all right? I'm very vividly remember going to dinner at his sister's house for the first time earlier on when we were dating, and just knowing, oh my gosh, like there's no way out if I don't understand something that they say and they don't understand something that I say, because there's no one at the table who speaks English besides me. So we just have to figure it out, right? So my Spanish has grown tremendously
Yeah.
thanks to him. And we while we were there, we got married. We had what I call our mixed race bilingual child, Luna. She's 4 now, but just going through all that, and then since then, we immigrated, or excuse me, relocated. My husband immigrated to the US where I grew up. We're in Florida, as you mentioned. And so now I see the world through very much through his eyes as an immigrant, as a Spanish speaker. Our household, we only speak Spanish at home. But now I've got this, like I said, this mixed race bilingual child,
Mhm.
and it's a lot to navigate, even down to filling out forms for her for school. What race is she? What ethnicity is she? Like
Yeah.
it's just a lot of things that are part of my daily basis, and I'm a marketer by trade. So whenever we combine like my entirety of life's experiences with this, both voluntarily and involuntarily, right? Um, it and you combine that with like my thoughts process on marketing, customer experience, and belonging, all of that kind of pulls it all together. And so, because I have all these identities, I mentioned before about autoimmune disorder, which means that one of the things as part of my diet is I follow a gluten-free diet. That's very prevalent in the things that I talk about. So there are so many different dimensions of diversity that I feel are present in just my day-to-day life, that I am able to think about inclusion from a number of different lenses.
Yes.
And because I'm able to see how people in my world respond to these different differences, it helps me think about things in a manner that helps other people understand and not feel so, I won't say intimidated or like they don't necessarily understand or defensive
Mm.
about it. Because we know that that's something whenever we say inclusion, sometimes people are kind of put their guard up and they don't want to
Oh,
hear
yeah.
about it. But we have to find a way to make people help people understand that this is applicable, and there's so many dimensions, and if they think hard enough, I'm sure it impacts them in their life in some way or someone that they love.
Wow. I really love how you've given us a holistic picture of your life, you know, growing up, moving to South America, your experience with, meeting your husband and he only speaking Spanish and you having to learn Spanish and be able to communicate and just to your daughter and filling out forms and just the full circle, your autoimmune disorder, just all those things that a lot of people take for granted. Because if you're not being faced with those things, you kind of your life is very much in a bubble and you just see it through the lens with which you live in and don't have the
Hmm.
appreciation of what perhaps others who have those things that are marked as differences have to experience. I remember coming to Australia about 25 years ago and having lived in Kenya all my life up until that point, I had traveled a little bit, but predominantly being surrounded by people who are Black. And arriving here and just feeling so Black, 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 Black. And I knew I was Black, but it was kind of like a wake-up call because everywhere I looked, Sonia, it was just a sea of whiteness. And there was this
Hmm.
feeling of not, obviously not belonging, feeling so out of place, wanting to blend in so hard. Like I don't want to stick out. I'm already somebody who's come from a different country. That's already,
Right.
a big adjustment. But the fact that I then look so different, that's something that's amplified. And it took a long time to get comfortable. It's being uncomfortable and getting comfortable being uncomfortable. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd love you to talk to me about the concept of belonging, if you can. And I want to
Mm-hmm.
quote something that you've said, that we all have at least one thing that makes us different. And because
Mm-hmm.
different is hard, most people work to hide their differences. They do it
Mm-hmm.
to feel normal. They do it to fit in. They do it to feel like they belong. Life is about belonging. And because of that, business too is about belonging.
Yeah, you were talking about your experiences in Australia as a Black woman and how like race was such a prevalent thing. And I identified with that very much, especially during my time in Argentina. I tell my husband all the time, like if I had $1 for every time someone asked me where I was from, that, I would have quite a bit, like just, on the street, like, in the pharmacy on the line or whatever, like just random, where are you from? Um, but at the same time, whenever Argentina and particularly Buenos Aires was very much a place where I felt like I belonged. Even though if you look at me, if you look at my background, my experiences, it's very different from everyone else. I was able to have that sense of belonging. And one of the things that clicked for me with that was that belonging isn't fully dependent upon you being around people who are like you, right? Or who look like you or have that same race as you.
Yeah.
One of my favorite definitions of belonging comes from this book called The Freaks Shall Inherit the Earth. It was written by Chris Brogan. And basically, what he's saying is belonging is letting out this deep breath that you didn't even know that you were holding whenever you have a realization that the people around you get you, right? And it's whatever the reason, it's hard to explain. I remember I heard this quote, somebody was telling me about it. They were talking about this famous quote about pornography. It was like, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, right? And so belonging can feel really hard to define
Right.
specifically what it is or feels like, but you know it whenever you feel it. You
Mhm.
know when you don't belong and when you know whenever you do belong, right? It's just this feeling that you have. And of course, there are things that we can do to help pave the way to create an environment that other people, no matter what it is about them, no matter their identity or their differences, so that they also can feel like they've been seen, they've been supported, and like you've thought about them in advance to try and create an environment where your differences are irrelevant. There's something that you don't even have to think about, right? And so that is really what's at the heart of it. How can you make someone feel seen and supported and like they are well cared for? Sometimes that is done intentionally, right? Sometimes it happens organically. Sometimes and the idea from a business standpoint is that we don't just wait for it to happen organically, that we are intentional about making sure that we think in advance about who are the people that we're serving
Mhm.
and how can we create experiences that basically answer the question for them, do people like me belong here? Do people like me achieve success here? And there are a number of things that you can do, But I would say that from a business standpoint, especially as you're thinking about coaches, people who have online businesses, etc., there are simple things that you can do to make people or to pave the way, lay that foundation for people to feel like they belong. And it's by thinking about how can you answer that question. Do people like insert the blank of whatever identity is? Do they belong here? People with disabilities, people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community, people who aren't tech savvy, people who are Black, people who have kids, people who speak another language, whatever it is, right? There's so many different dimensions of diversity. But if you think about, can people who are coming to engage with your brand, however they describe or think about themselves, or their point of difference, do people like me belong here, find success here? If you can find a way to answer that question or find ways to answer that question for them clearly and quickly, you will find that you will do a better job of converting more different types of people because why? They will feel like they belong with you.
Mhm. That is such a beautiful explanation. I feel like, what I've taken out of that is that belonging is so personal. It
Hmm.
really is a personal thing. And it's about intimately knowing the people who you serve. This is not
Yes.
just a kind of like a blanket thing where, oh, everybody is included or everybody
Right.
belongs here. This is really intentional. Belonging and bringing that out has to be really personal and intentional. And where I often find myself getting stuck, I mean, my focus is very much on race, and that's where
Hmm.
the inclusion bit comes in for me, is for online business owners, for them, it's not just the race factor. There's other different elements of diversity. How
Right.
do you take that into account without completely overwhelming yourself and potentially never getting started because there's diversity of, those who have a disability, the LGBTQIA plus community, there's race, there's religion, and other many, many other forms
Hmm.
of diversity. How do you narrow down on which one it is, or how do you encompass everything?
Yeah. So the first or the biggest myth about inclusive marketing is that it means that you have to serve everyone. And that is not true. Now, listen, you can. If you've got the resources to be able to do this well, you can absolutely make it your mission to try and serve everyone. But most businesses, most online businesses, most solopreneurs, most coaches, like they cannot do that, right? It's a very tall order. And like you said, it gets people stuck because it's like, oh, I can't do it.
Yeah,
And then you feel like you're just not being inclusive at all. And you're just like, okay, why do I even bother?
yeah.
That's not the objective. Inclusive marketing, it's all about, and this is the definition, acknowledging the many ways in which people are different and then intentionally choosing. This is the big part. Intentionally choosing which of the identities, which points of difference do you want to make sure that you are intentionally serving within your business, and then incorporating those identities throughout other areas of your, like throughout all areas of your marketing mix. So, a quick example is we are doing this podcast in English, right? Of course, there are obviously so many other languages in the world. You've probably made this choice subconsciously to make your content available in English, right? Because you could make it available in other languages that requires different resources, etc., whole different sort of systems, etc., to be able to do that. Does that mean that you're not being inclusive? No, because I'm sure that you're focused on other dimensions of inclusion and diversity, etc. And we have to work within the constraints that they have. I mentioned my husband speaks Spanish. and I'm going to be leaning harder into YouTube this year. I'm very much thinking about, okay, what does the workload look like if I want to make my content available in English and Spanish? That's a choice that I am thinking about making, right? And thinking about what are the resources and the processes necessary. But if I only launch in English, that's still okay because I know in the future I would like to make it available in Spanish. And maybe, hey, if it works well in Spanish, we can think about how do we do this and replicate this process in other languages, right? So it part of what it is we have to think about also what are our own values and what is the culture that we want to create. And a lot of times, especially for people who have online businesses, coaches, etc., like you said before, this is a very personal thing. So you
Mhm.
might start in areas that are dimensions of diversity that are very important to you. One of the things whenever I do brand audits, one of the things that I like to do is talk to people who have the identities of the people that the brand wants to serve to see how are they responding. And I remember there's a woman, or I like to call her an analyst, that I've talked to a couple of different times for a couple of different brands. And the thing that she's a black woman, right? She also follows a gluten-free diet, but the thing I hear her talking about most
Yeah.
is middle-aged, right? She's almost 50 and she's very hyper aware of how well brands are showing people like me, right? And from that standpoint, people like me, whenever she's looking at, often means people who are in middle age and starting to lean a little bit older because she sees that a lot of the imagery is for Gen Z, it's for younger people who she's not identifying with, right? And so we also have to consider that we are multifaceted people, and there's a lot of intersections of our identities. And so sometimes me being a Black woman is more important. Sometimes being a woman is the thing that I'm thinking about. Other times it's being a mom. Other times it's my age, right? Like, so these things flip at very different points in time based upon what it is that we need, what it is that we're buying, what it is that, we're going through in that point in time, who we're making decisions for. So all that could be super overwhelming. So that's why it's super helpful for you to choose who are the identities that I specifically want to make sure feel like they belong with my brand, and then what do I need to do throughout the rest of my marketing to
Mhm.
make sure that they feel seen, supported, and like they belong. Now, one quick point. If whenever you choose, that does not mean that other people who don't fall into that identity, that does not mean that they are not welcome,
Yeah.
that you don't want them to feel like they belong, that you cannot include them in your promotional materials and your campaigns. Like, that's not what that means at all. It just means specifically I want to make sure that people, if you've chosen people who are part of the Muslim faith, I want to make sure that they know that people like them, and I'm using quote unquote marks like with my fingers, belong with you. So I'm gonna make sure that I'm doing different things. Or I want to know that I want people who are from Kenya, right, to know that they belong here. I want to know that if you are a woman and you don't have kids, that you belong here, right? Like you are going to choose what that is for your brand. It doesn't mean that you're just like naturally excluding people. It just means this is where you're going to focus more of your energy and your time to just make sure that you are preparing the environment to be right for them. One
Mm,
other just quick thing to kind of illustrate this, because
sure.
I mentioned that I'm gluten free. Um, there's this cupcake brand that I love. It's called Sprinkles Cupcakes or Sprinkles Bakery. They have made a choice, right, that they are going to serve gluten-free people. They have gluten-free red velvet cupcakes. They have maybe one or two other options. They also have one or two vegan options, and they have one that are sugar-free. 90% of their product line does not take into account, like, is not vegan, gluten-free, or sugar-free, right?
Mhm, mhm.
However, I love this bakery because there's something that I can go. People like me
Absolutely.
belong there, right? Like, I can go and find something, but the majority of the clientele doesn't have any of this. It's
Yeah.
just that they've been very specific and intentional about serving those types of people with those dietary restrictions. Everyone else is still welcome, but we specifically feel seen as well at the same time.
And that's where belonging then checks in because it's
Mhm.
so personal. You feel like they're
Yeah.
taking to that personal need that you have that you can't
Mhm.
find in other places. So it comes back to belonging. Um,
Mhm.
just staying on that inclusive marketing that
Mhm.
you've mentioned and the definition that you've given us, which is great because I feel like it's freed a lot of people who are listening and they're kind of going like, well, where do I focus? What do I need to? Is it everything? Is it one thing? And just going back to
Yeah.
your value system, what is important to you? Who do you want to feel is represented here? Who do you want to feel like they belong? And then going on that journey to understand what their needs are so that you are properly representing.
Yeah.
And so you share that inclusive marketing is the future of marketing. And I
Mhm.
wonder, Sonia, given everything that is happening right now in the United States, where there's such a huge rollback
Mhm.
of DEI, where do you see the future of inclusive marketing as it is right now?
I see it continuing, right? Inclusive marketing is still the future of marketing. Why? Because inclusive marketing is just good marketing, right? So let's use Walmart as an example,
Mhm.
right? I think they're the largest retailer in the world. I remember checking I remember, like, I wrote an article about this whenever they implemented sensory friendly hours, right? Which basically that means from 8 to 10 a.m. every day in all the stores across the US and Puerto Rico. Walmart had the lights dimmed, they had the music turned off or it was super low. The TV screens that they had a static image. Why did they do this? Because they got feedback that there were a number of team members, consumers, or customers, or caregivers of customers who were overstimulated by the traditional environment that they have in the store. People with sensory processing disorder, that is very much it's people with autism, some people with autism, people with ADHD, PTSD, right? There are a number of different neurodivergent uh, areas of neurodivergence that also have sensory processing disorder, right? And so what was happening? They either weren't going in the stores or they were going in the stores and having a terrible experience,
Yeah.
right? So Walmart implemented these hours. People were so happy, right? And because they had a time, they had an option to be able to go in. Now, Walmart is one of those companies that has rolled back some of their DE&I stance. The
Mm.
sensory the sensory friendly hours. I need to double check this, but I'm pretty sure they're still in place. Why? Because there's still people with this need. Like, that need didn't go away because there's some controversy surrounding it. I want to be clear, like, diversity, equity, inclusion is not the same as inclusive marketing. They're close cousins, right?
Mhm.
They're related, they're connected, but they're two different things, right? Inclusive marketing is marketing. It's just good marketing. And whenever you find out that the people that you're serving have a need that you aren't fulfilling, good marketers find a way to meet that need. And so, what we want to think about, inclusive marketing is a growth lever. It is how you run your business. Like, it's a way in which to grow your business because it allows you to serve a broader diversity of consumers who have the problem that your brand solves, right? And it helps to keep them loyal because people who are part of these underrepresented, underserved communities are so used to being ignored, right? Whenever
Mhm.
they find a brand who sees them and supports them and caters to them, they are loyal. I can't tell you how many sprinkles cupcakes I bought. That was a cake that I had at my wedding, right? Like so like it's like I any opportunity I can
Yeah.
have to go to sprinkles. How many times do I talk about sprinkles, right? Like and why? Because they've seen me, right? And so that loyalty and that lifetime value of a customer is very important. You have to incorporate that. Too often,
Mhm.
people, whenever they're thinking about inclusive marketing, they're only focused on the moral imperative. This is the right thing to do. And it is, right? Like it's a good thing to include more people. But the moral imperative is not the language of business, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
The language of business is sales, it's profit, it's growth, and inclusive marketing increases your sales, it increases your profit, it increases your growth, it increases increases the amount of customers that you have.
Right.
It does all that. If you do it well, and if you do it sustained over time, you will see benefits to your business. And I don't think Walmart implemented sensory-friendly hours because, oh, this is just the right thing. They did it because they know this means more people can come into our
That's
stores.
right.
And whenever you're in the store, you're more likely to buy more things, right? Like there was very clear business benefits to doing that. So we're seeing these brands roll back diversity, equity, inclusion, but
Mhm.
we also need to understand that increasingly consumers are making decisions based upon whether or not brands align with their values. So, as brands are rolling back on diversity, equity, inclusion, if this is a value of the consumers that they're serving, yes, there are some people who don't care about it. They're anti-diversity inclusion, but there are also people on the other side of this thing who want to buy from brands who have those values, who
Yeah.
support people who were like them and the people they care about. So people are using their credit cards as a form of activism, right?
Mhm.
So we need to know that inclusive marketing is good marketing. So not only do you want to think about it and how it's going to grow your business, but also think about how it's a part of the value system of a lot more consumers. 82% of consumers are making decisions based upon their values and that values alignment. So we don't want to like just discount this thing. This is what people are doing. It's why we're buying women owned, buying black owned, buying, LGBTQ plus friendly, right? Like we're doing that because we're making buying decisions based upon our values.
Mhm. Coming back to our values yet again. And I want to switch gears a little bit now and talk about the state of representation in marketing, particularly
Mhm,
now in 2025. I'm particularly interested to know about the demographics because there's race to consider, there's,
mhm,
earning ability, income, to the things that perhaps are ranked, most important when it comes to representation. So please talk us through this. I know this is a big piece because it's
mhm,
it's a survey that's been done
mhm.
and it's huge and it encompasses so many things. But perhaps if you could just kind of unpack that for us so that we can understand how important representation is, because we often say representation matters. It's so important. It's everything. But we can entirely miss the whole point.
Right, right. Okay, so representation is really what I like to call the on-ramp of inclusive marketing. It's often where a lot of people start out because they think, oh, like I can think about changing up my visual imagery, whether that's stock photography, whether that's the people that I'm incorporating in my podcast or the testimonials that I'm featuring. But why is representation so important? And it goes back to that fundamental question that we were talking about previously. Do people like me belong here?
Mhm.
Right? And representation is a very important and easy way to clearly and quickly communicate that people like me belong here, right? And so whenever we see people in the testimonials who are like me and they've achieved success, okay, that gives me a signal that I might belong here as well, right? Like whenever we see people that you're featuring on social media, etc., or just people in your ads or your Facebook ads or whatever type of campaigns that you're using, it sends a signal. We're not just talking about representation for representation's sake. It's the objective and the job of representation is to show people like me belong here. Okay. So with this study that I did one in 2021 and then I repeated it and I'm going to be publishing very soon the results of it. But I believe it was 3 out of 4 people, and I talked to 1,000 people in each of the iterations. 3 out of 4 people said representation is important to them for the brands that they engage with and buy from. And as I was drilling down and asking different questions, I was super curious to find out, did representate, like it's one thing to say, yeah, this is important to me, but I also wanted to know, did it impact their buying decisions?
Mhm.
And so I said, well, what do you do whenever you see yourselves represented? Whenever you don't see yourself represented? And I believe it was like a third of the people were like, oh, just continue to buy from them, right? Because for people who were part of underrepresented, underserved communities, they're used to not being represented. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like the default, right? But
Mm.
the interesting thing for me was, what do you do when you do see yourself represented? And I believe it was like 75% of people said, I buy from that company, right? And so we have to understand again, when it comes to representation, there's so many different dimensions of diversity. So that woman that I would mention before when I was doing the audits, for her, in the thing that was present for her mind was age representation,
Yeah.
right? And of course that depends on what your types of things that you're buying. For
Mhm.
some people, it might be race and ethnicity. For others, it might be gender. For others, it might be body type. There's so many different dimensions, which is why it's super important to go back to what we were saying originally. You have to choose. So, whenever you're choosing the identities that you want to serve, that helps you identify what are the specific ones that you want to make sure that you're including as part of your representation overall, right? And so, whenever I was going through and I was asking, well, what types of things do you need to see in
Mhm.
representation? Is there some representation that makes it feel more impactful than others? So, there's like paid talent, like spokesperson, or maybe it's an influencer that you've paid to talk about your product. Is it testimonials, like people who've actually bought your product and achieved success? Is it the team that you have as a founder, whether you have a team of 5 people or 3 people, right? What does your team look like? Um, I remember I was doing a photo shoot and I wanted this pair of earrings. And this pair of earrings really stems from, I don't know what country in Africa, but they're like a very African style earrings. And I saw them, I wanted them, and I was looking and I found a pair. And then I looked and I was like, the people selling this are not from, they are not from the continent of Africa. And I
Mhm.
was like,
Mhm.
that representation felt even like they're selling a product that is like what I was looking for.
Yeah.
It didn't feel authentic in that sense. So I
Mhm.
went and found a woman who actually, was from the countries who were producing this type of earrings. But that was important to me because it was kind of that continuity of authenticity, right? And then there's another area in terms of like featured experts. I don't know about you, but I like listening to podcasts, right? I like going to conferences, whether they're in person or virtual.
Mhm.
There's a lot of talk about panels, right? Like these are like all male panels, but and people are like more and more starting to not be accepting that this is just the way it is.
Yeah.
Clearly, there have to be women who are experts on this topic, but more and more we're starting to see like listen, like, why aren't there any black people or black women included or women of color or whatever point of difference you are or that is important to you? Because we said this is personal.
Mhm.
Like, if we don't see that type of representation on your list of 100 episodes on your podcast, if everybody kind of has the same background and we see this over and over again, that type of representation is important, right? And it matters because it's sending a signal, it's sending a message. But like so when I was asking people like what are the forms of representation that are most important to you, they were around testimonials, featured experts, right? The team that you have. And that can be like your extended team as well. So it's less about just changing up the physical, the imagery on your stock photography, because also like there have been some brands who showcased imagery that looks representative, but that's not actually what their client base looks like. That's not actually what their team looks like. It's just changing the imagery and it's super inauthentic.
Mm.
So those are the types of things that are important. And then an additional layer to this is like, where do we want, like, what makes representation authentic? Is it just you're in the picture? One of the things, and it's not, right? Like, we, there are a couple of like pet peeves that people talk about, particularly people from underrepresented and underserved communities, because it feels like as that people are trying to check a box as it relates to representation. So, do we have a woman? Check. Do we have a black person? Check.
Mhm.
Do we have, someone who is Asian? Check, right? Like we'll see those types of where it feels like this is what they've done, but let's say these people from underrepresented and underserved communities, they don't have speaking roles. They're just placed there.
Mhm.
They're the sidekick, like not the main character, the featured character. So like the phrase that I like to use as it relates to this is, do we have main character energy, right? For the people who are part of these communities that you're represented, are they just there to check these boxes that you've diversified or you've included more people? Or like, are they the lead? Have you written content for them? I love the Bridgerton series from that Shonda Rhimes has brought to life on
Yeah.
Netflix. And there's a lot of intentional
Oh, yes.
inclusion there, right? Oh my gosh, I love Queen Charlotte, right? But there's
Mhm.
things that it's not just afterthoughts, it's not box checking. There's more and some intentionality associated with that about some of these main characters and other characters who are super important to the overall story that's being told. And that's what people want to see. They don't want to just feel like, oh, like, here's a black person. Are you happy? No, we want to see that you've actually taken the time to show a story, tell a little bit more about this person. So we understand that because we said people are more nuanced than just race or ethnicity, etc. Can we identify with the background of this person? So whenever I'm saying, do people like me belong here? I have enough information besides just a photo to say that, yeah, this person really is like me. And so those are like the nuances associated with representation. And one other little watch out that I want to um, bring up is that the imagery that you're using, you want it to actually two watch outs. You want to make sure that you're not reinforcing negative stereotypes with that imagery. Customer intimacy or having a deep degree of knowledge about the identities of the people that you want to serve will help you understand like what to say, what not to say to like, avoid some of those stereotypes. But also, one thing that I find that many brands do, a lot of large brands, but smaller brands I see will do this. They try to use what I think of as racially ambiguous people to try and check multiple boxes at multiple times. And
Yeah.
that doesn't work so well. It often has the opposite impact
Mhm.
because no one actually sees themselves fully represented. You're still leaving people out. So
Yeah.
just one other just like little practical thing to think about as you're going through and thinking about representation. Focus on the identity, real identities, real people telling their stories in a way not like a checkbox exercise.
Mm. I think what's going to stay with me is that main character energy that you so beautifully elaborated on and even used Bridgerton as an example of how they've done that so intentionally. And one of the things that I often tell my clients, my listeners, my students is that if you're just kind of just using images or even trying to come across that you are inclusive, kind of virtue signaling, it'll catch
Hmm.
up. It'll catch up to you. People will catch on, especially when they sign on and the experience is not what they expected it to be, because on paper,
Yeah.
you're one thing, but the customer experience is so, so important. And I think we should talk about customer experience because it's all tied in with
Hmm.
belonging, it's tied in with inclusion marketing. But one of the things I also noted from the survey was particularly from Black and Brown people talking about their skin tone. It's not just about representing somebody who is brown and it's the lightest shade of brown, or
Hmm.
black and it's the darkest shade of black. Like it's like either
Hmm.
two
Which is
extremes.
almost never is. It almost never is the
Yeah,
darkest shade
yeah,
of.
exactly, exactly. And
Yeah.
there's never like an in between. And even when I
Hmm.
think about hair texture, we often don't see that afro kinky kind of hair being
Yeah.
showcased. And so that was so important to hear that from people who are black and brown and people of color saying it matters. The
It
tone
does.
matters. Complexion
Yeah.
matters.
Yeah, I did a an audit for a client recently, and they did a good job with their imagery of Black women in particular. That was one of the groups that they identified that they wanted to speak to. However, all the Black women, let's say 95% of the Black women in their imagery had straight or curly hair. It wasn't like kinky. It wasn't like braids. It wasn't afro. It wasn't locks or anything like that. It was straight or curly, right? And so we're like, we got to work on that. I know it wasn't something that they were intentionally doing, but whatever
Absolutely.
you're looking at it in the totality of all the images that you've presented, that's what we've got here. And it sends a message that you probably don't want to send.
For sure. And for me, I've been on a journey with my hair.
Hmm.
And when I came to Australia, I had natural afro hair and I came with braids, really
Hmm.
thin Rwandese braids is what they were called back in the day. And I kept them on for about 3, 4 months and it was time to take it off, took it off, and it was, oh my God, just not, and I have a long, big, like my hair is voluminous. And
Hmm.
it wasn't easy. It just, and the thing
No.
is, it not only was it not easy to care for it when I took down the braids, I didn't know how to care for it because
Hmm.
we as Black people, even though I come from Kenya,
Yeah.
we still don't know how to care
Yeah.
for Afro hair. We haven't schooled ourselves on that because we've always looked to the West. We've seen what
Hmm.
beauty standards are, and we've then tried to be that. And so I remember going home not long after that. I think it was a month or so later going home. And the first stop, I kid you not, Sonia, after my family
I
picked me
believe
up,
it. I believe it.
was to the hair salon.
Yeah.
Lady was waiting for me with relaxer, and I had always
Yeah.
wanted to, chemically straighten my hair, but my mom was like, "You're not doing this. You're not doing this."
Yeah.
Bad for
Yeah.
me, even though herself she had chemically straightened hair.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when they met me at the airport, they're like, "Oh, baby, we gotta take you to the salon."
Yeah.
And so I got my hair chemically, and it was cool. It was all fine. It was so much more manageable. And
Right.
then a few years ago, it just changed for me. And I'm like, I can't keep doing this, especially now knowing what the impact is of
Hmm.
chemically straightening your hair. So I went on a journey to go back to natural, which
Hmm.
I have. And now it's just that I've had it flat ironed. I haven't had it flat ironed in like 3 months. So I need
Okay.
a haircut. And so it's normally not like this. But it's been such a journey to embrace that. And initially, it felt like I occupied too much space with my natural hair. As I said, it's quite
Mm-hmm.
voluminous. And when I
Hmm.
wear it in its, normal
Yeah.
without heat, I just feel like, oh my gosh, it's too big. I need to
Yeah.
be smaller. And so,
Yeah.
all of this to say that if we normalized seeing that, if we
Hmm.
normalized that being something that is part of a different kind of diversity, it wouldn't
Yeah.
make one feel like they need to minimize themselves or like they're
Right.
occupying too much space.
Right. Right. And so we always hear the thing like representation matters. It matters because it impacts the way people feel about themselves. What is professional? What isn't, right? Like I remember I'm starting the process. I'm in the baby stages of my second round of locks, right? But I remember the first time that I had locks, I was working in corporate. Well, actually, I was working in corporate, but I remember whenever I did the big chop. When I was working in corporate and walking around with an afro, trying to figure it out. And I remember someone pulled me aside and was like you're gonna need to work on this a little bit. Why? Because at that point in time, there was a perception about like what looks professional and what
Mhm.
doesn't. And so these things influence us. So that's why marketing is so powerful because it impacts the way that people feel about themselves, whether they can take up space, whether they cannot, whether they need to assimilate or feel like they need to assimilate, or whether they can just be who they are as they are. And belonging does not force you to assimilate, right? Like belonging allows you to be who you are as you are.
Belonging does not force you to assimilate. Goodness, so many like aha moments I'm having here. I need to write down some of these things. So many ahas. I love that. Yes. Yes, belonging doesn't force you to assimilate. That is just so powerful. As we bring this to a close, Sonia, and I feel bad because I could go on and on and on. This is like a master class. This is not even a podcast episode. Y'all should be writing. You should be taking notes if you're listening to this driving. Come back, sit down,
Definitely
take
will come
notes.
back. We'll come back.
Because this is so, so important, especially when you apply it. What I love about what we're talking about is it's really bringing in understanding. There's one thing to know that this is important. It's another to understand, like you get it. I understand now why representation
Hmm.
matters. I understand now why inclusive marketing is the future. I understand now why belonging is so important, not just in life, but in business too. Having that understanding then allows you to take action, accordingly. And I want to end by
Can I just tell a quick super story, a
oh,
quick
sure.
story to kind of illustrate exactly what you're saying? So my daughter, she's 4. And my niece plays basketball. And she's 17, she's about to be 18. So we often go to her basketball games. And my husband is Argentine soccer or football,
Of
is
course.
very popular. So whenever we watch the Argentine national team playing, we're watching the Argentine national team men, right? Like, so just to that context. So my sister says to her, hey, Luna, do you want to play basketball whenever you grow up, when you get bigger? And she's like, yeah, and then she said, so then she's like, oh, thinking about, football and Argentine culture. She's like, do you want to play football too? And she paused and she's like, no. And she's like, why? And she's like, football is for boys. And so we were just kind of sitting there like, why does she think that? Oh, basketball, girls, because we're seeing my niece play and her team play. Football, boys, because who we watch on TV
That's
are
right.
the men's teams. What is that? That's representation influencing a 4-year-old already, right?
For
On
sure.
what is for me, what isn't for me. It's
Mhm.
answering the question, people like me belong here, people like me don't belong here. So I just want people to realize like we're not, this is, yes, about marketing, increasing your sales and growth. But
Mhm.
fundamentally, it's bigger than that because you're sending these messages about what people like, insert whatever,
Yes.
can and can't do, where they do and don't belong. So that's why we have to think about this in the context of belonging and making sure that we're communicating that. And representation is a really powerful way to help do that. or not,
Absolutely.
right?
Not, yes, absolutely. And so, as we bring this conversation that I do not want to end to a close, uh, what can you leave us with, Sonia, in terms of effective, long-term inclusive marketing strategies? Like if somebody is on this journey, particularly now speaking to white women in online business who want to be more racially inclusive, which is my area of expertise, a lot of times they will come on this journey, they'll take my course represented, they'll do it, they will feel a certain way. And when we're together
Hmm.
in that container for 10 weeks, you know, they're active, they're having conversations, and it's really affecting them and it's personal. But when the work comes to an end, when the program ends, majority of them come back and say, I haven't found myself being active. This work kind of just fell off the rails. And it's because it doesn't impact me directly on a day-to-day basis. And so I have to be so intentional to stay in the work. And so how can they have effective long-term inclusive marketing strategies that see them do this work for a much, much longer time?
They have to tie it to their business results. It has to be an understanding that you're not doing like it's a priority because it's tied to the people that you serve. So just a quick example to illustrate, I mentioned I'm gluten free. My mom doesn't, whenever I go eat at her house or when we go out to eat together, it's not like an optional thing. She's thinking about it or not. If she wants me to feel like I belong, which she does, she's proactively thinking about how can I change this thing?
Yes.
Sonia, you should choose where we go eat. Can you eat here? You know, like it's a constant sort of thing. She is being mindful of me and my dietary restrictions, and now my sister as well.
Yeah.
She wants us to feel like we belong. If you think about the people that you're serving, your existing customers, the customers that you want to serve,
Mhm.
flip in your mind that this is how can I make sure that these are my people? How can I make sure that they have an experience that makes them feel like they belong? The people that I'm serving today and
Mhm.
the people that I'm serving that I want to serve in the future. If you think about it not as in I have to remember to do this, but no, I have to do this because the people that I'm serving need it, they expect it, and the people that I want to serve in the future need it and expect it. And they are going to make a choice about whether or not they're going to come to me, whether or not they're going to go to someone else, or whether or not they're going to get their estate, like keep their money in their pocket, right? Based upon how well you are showing them, do people like them belong with you? It's a business decision. It's a business priority. And so if you make it that it's a part of doing good marketing,
Yeah.
it doesn't become something that you have to remember to do. It's something that you know, if I want to serve these people, then
Mhm.
I have to change the way I operate, and show up so that they know that people like them belong with me. It's a business decision. That's how you make it a lasting part of what you do versus a nice to do. And that makes it, it takes the emphasis off of yourself and puts it on the people that you're serving and that you want to serve.
Yes, tying this back to your business results. So inclusion shouldn't be just a good to have. It should be part and parcel of the goals
Hmm.
that you have in your business, and it should be tied to your business results. That is
Right.
powerful. And that is,
Yeah. You don't do email marketing because it's a good thing to do and people say that you do it. You do email marketing because it impacts your business result, right? Same thing, same type
100%.
of thing.
100% it does. And this is a really great place for us to close this conversation. But I want to end by asking a question that I ask all my guests, particularly, you know, this platform is very much about amplifying Black, Indigenous, Brown, people of color. And a
Hmm.
lot of times for us to step out and do the kind of work that we do, it requires a lot of courage because a lot of times the spaces we occupy are spaces that don't reflect who we are. And so I wonder, Sonia, if fear wasn't a factor, how do you think you would show up in your work?
Mm. Let me give you a very specific example.
Yes.
I would create content in Spanish because my Spanish is, I'm fluent, but I'm very imperfect, right? But
Mhm.
I would do it anyway because I know that it would reach a large demographic of people. So if I just get over the fact that it's going to be imperfect. It was going to be imperfect if I'm doing it. Right? If I'm speaking it, but I would still do it because I know the information, like people aren't expecting imperfection from me. They are more interested in being included in getting access to the information that I'm sharing. And so that's what I would, that's a starting, like a very practical starting point that I would just get over myself and do it.
I think you should. I think you should. We are our biggest critics. And one of the things that gets me through stuff is imperfect action. Just stay
Hmm.
imperfect action and just go ahead and do it. And so I hope in the near future to hear
Yeah.
something Spanish coming through the airwaves from you, Sonia.
Thank you.
Um,
I will let you know whenever I do.
Yes, please do. Now, tell us, where can people connect with you? Where's the best place for them to find you, connect with you, consume your content?
Go to inclusionandmarketing.com/newsletter. And then you'll get onto my weekly newsletter where I send I give news, insights, resources, mini rants, hot topics, and I love relating the thoughts that I have to what's happening right now in culture, and what's in the news, so you can like really have practical application and understanding. So get on the newsletter, and then you will get access to everything that I'm producing, as well as like all of it beyond.
Yeah, I am a subscriber of your newsletter, and I have to say, I love how you incorporate current affairs. There was the Blake Lively
Mhm.
situation that you've spoken to, and I have no doubt you will be covering something to do with the Super Bowl. I have no
Yeah, I'm
doubt that
working on it
you're
right
cooking
now.
up
I'm working on it
something
right
right now.
now.
Hey,
Yeah, so much to talk about, but yes, I've already
there
published
is.
an article. I'm working on another one. So when I finish with you, I'm gonna go finish it, and then a podcast coming out tomorrow. Yeah.
Oh, so y'all, by the time you are getting this episode, probably those resources will already be out. So head
Hmm.
over, subscribe, join her newsletter. As you've seen, this has been such generosity with your knowledge. People charge for this, and you get paid for this, of course, for what you've shared with us here. And I am so, so grateful. Thank you so much for the tangible examples that you've shared. You are truly really just masterful in how you do marketing. And for me, what it's done and what I wasn't expecting is that it's allowed me to take steps closer to you, your work, and your brand. So I will be a continued listener, but more than anything, I am so grateful that you said yes. And we've had this conversation today, Sonia. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a true joy. You have no idea.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. P. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.
Represented from coast to coast.